Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, and welcome to this episode of Countercurrents. Today, I will not be interviewing a guest. I'll be talking about the issue that I think many need to understand with respect to the war in Ukraine. President Putin talks about solving root causes, but has not really gone into depth to explain what those root causes are, at least recently. You can go back and watch his speech that was presented on February 24th, 2022, at the start of what is then known as the Special Military Operation. And he discussed in depth those root causes. The root cause is really quite simple: the expansion of NATO to the east. In my previous monologue, I laid out in depth and detail that with the fall and collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Russia now as an independent state, Ukraine as an independent state, instead of the United States and Western Europe creating the equivalent of a Marshall Plan to help those countries through the transition, they lined up like rapists to seize as many of the resources, control as many of the manufacturing industry and natural resources of Russia, including oil, gas, gold, uranium. No hand of help or friendship was really offered. They dressed it up under the Partnership for Peace and claimed that they were trying to partner both with Russia and with Ukraine. But the reality of what was taking place was quite different. I've asked one very simple question in a recent piece. Why the hell was NATO expanding when the military force in Russia was shrinking? Right at the end, when Russia broke up, its military force stood at about 4 million men, just shy, about 3.5 million. And within a year, the numbers had fallen down to 1.2 million. And yet, in the ensuing 20 years, when the Russian military did not, I repeat, did not increase in size up to 2011, the West embarked upon a very dramatic expansion of NATO. Bill Clinton started it off in 1999, adding 3 countries: Poland, Romania, and the Czech Republic, I believe. That brought NATO's size to 21 countries. 5 years later, George W. Bush in 2004 expanded NATO with 7 additional countries, bringing it up to 28. Barack Obama added 1 and made it 29, and Donald Trump added another 30, and then Joe Biden added 3 more. It has only been since the start of the special military operation that Russia has expanded the size of its military. When you go back and look at what transpired in 1999, that was a critical year. On March 12th, Bill Clinton, against the advice of longtime Soviet hands such as George Kennan, had advised against, and not just advised, had strongly warned that expanding NATO would be a red line for Russia. But Clinton ignored it. There was too much pressure from the military-industrial center to expand the number of NATO countries so that they would be able to buy more weapons. And we had to, again, portray Russia as this great threat. But no, during the entirety of the 1990s, up until 2008, the Russian military took no aggressive action against anyone. It was just the opposite, in fact. With the expansion of NATO in March 12th of 1999, 2 weeks later, Russia watched as expanded NATO attacked, bombed Russian allies in Serbia and Belgrade. It was just, the West came up with the usual excuses. But this was more about humiliating and warning Russia who the new sheriff in town was. Then, a few months later, on August 7th, the Second Chechen War started. Now, this was not an uprising of local Muslims who were oppressed and beaten. This was a Western-inspired insurgency with funding and support from the West. I believe the CIA was directly involved. I can't show you a document to that effect, but I have heard through friends that in fact was the case. That war was a war to destroy Russia, cutting it up under its belly. So it's no coincidence that 2 days later, then President Boris Yeltsin named a new prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Putin was now in the midst, he jumped out of the frying pan and was firmly in the fire. And having to cobble together both this NATO offensive, dealing with the NATO offensive in Belgrade and Serbia, and this terrorist-backed offensive with Western-backed offensive by radical Islamist terrorists. 4 months later, Yeltsin resigned, and Putin was elected as president. It was at that point that Putin began the restoration project, trying to restore Russia. But again, he did not engage in military conflict, military conquests, offered support to the United States during its effort to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Then we jump to 2007. Now again, during this entire period, Russia's not building more tanks, building more planes, building an army. It's not making threatening noises. None of that. It's the West that's talking about expanding NATO. And at a Munich Security Conference in December of 2007, Vladimir Putin issued a very, very strong warning about, look, this has to stop. The West ignored it. They continued their efforts to expand NATO. And so then in March of 2008, Vladimir Putin again warns against the expansion of NATO. But NATO by this point was keen on bringing in both Ukraine and Georgia. And they didn't back away from that. And encouraged, provoked the uprising within Georgia that led to a Soviet retaliation, and the Soviets defeated it, easily quashed it in 2008. That was the point, finally, that Vladimir Putin recognized this can't continue. We're at war with the West. And so he began the process of reforming the Russian military without building it up, but getting rid of old officers, updating the curriculum, if you will, in the war colleges, modernizing the force. Putin was wise enough to recognize Russia was in no condition to fight NATO or the United States at that time. So he took great care to protect Russia's interests. Again, here is the West expanding NATO, trying to claim that they're doing it because Vladimir Putin's trying to restore the old Soviet empire when there was absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. It was a blatant lie. Then we come to 2014 and the Maidan, where Western intelligence agencies, and using as well as USAID, were funding opposition groups, bringing in outsiders, paying people to protest, staging riots, and even bringing in outsiders, Georgians that acted as snipers, killing many Ukrainians in the crowd in order to suggest that this was the Russian doing when it was not. It was a false flag. But that led to the coup and the ouster of the then Ukrainian leader because he was perceived or described as too pro-Russian. At that point, Russia came to realize it was at a war with NATO. But there were limits to what Russia could do. And Putin was biding his time. We know that it was in the presidency of Donald John Trump that instead of backing away, trying to ease tensions with Russia, Trump kept in place the sanctions that had been imposed by Barack Obama in the closing days of his administration, onerous sanctions, and increased the pace of military exercises, adding more military exercises with Ukraine. And the nature of those exercises became more offensive with anti-submarine warfare and amphibious warfare as important components of those exercises. Trump also began sending Javelin missiles to be used as anti-tank missiles to destroy Russian tanks in the event of an attack. And sort of the ultimate insult was allowing B-52 bombers to fly along the Crimea coast. Putin sat and watched and waited. What came on February 24th was the final eruption, if you will, of Soviet anger. Its patience had been tried. Let me read a couple of paragraphs from President Putin's speech that he presented on the evening of February 24th, 2022. Putin said, "It is a fact that over the past 30 years, we have been patiently trying to come to an agreement with the leading NATO countries regarding the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. In response to our proposals, we invariably faced either cynical deception and lies or attempts at pressure and blackmail. While the North Atlantic Alliance continued to expand despite our protests and concerns. Its military machine is moving and, as I said, is approaching our very border. Why is this happening? Where did this insolent manner of talking down from the height of their exceptionalism, infallibility, and all permissiveness come from? What is the explanation for this contemptuous and disdainful attitude to our interests and absolutely legitimate demands? The answer is simple. Everything is clear and obvious. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union grew weaker and subsequently broke apart. That experience should serve as a good lesson for us because it has shown us that the paralysis of power and will is the first step towards complete degradation and oblivion. We lost confidence for only one moment, but it was enough to disrupt the balance of forces in the world." Vladimir Putin has now proposed meeting without conditions with the Ukrainians to begin talks towards obtaining a ceasefire, if possible. But the ceasefire is going to be carried out under very specific parameters. Number one, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. These are now Russian republics. They are part of the Russian Federation. They will not be separated again voluntarily from Russia. So that is one issue on the table that Ukraine is going to have to swallow. Crimea is not going back. Crimea is, as it was, a part of Russia for centuries. What Russia will be pressing for is the end of all NATO presence in Ukraine, an end to Ukraine's participation in NATO exercises, an end to the supply and the destruction, actual destruction of NATO weapon systems, HIMARS in particular, then the end of all intelligence and material support provided to Ukraine. Those have to go. Beyond that, there is the concern of the new NATO bases, the new one that's being a monster base being built in Romania, the base that currently exists in Poland, and then with the addition of Norway, Sweden, Finland into NATO, or particularly Sweden and Finland, we now face Russia with specific demands that they need to back away. Russia is in no interest in continuing the war, provided that they can get the security guarantees they want. But the West, I judge, is unwilling to provide those security guarantees. And as such, I think this war will continue. That's my assessment. I'm Larry Johnson. You've been watching Countercurrents. If you like this, if you found it useful, please hit the like and subscribe button. Tell your friends about it. And we'll see you again. Thanks for watching.